Good evening, everybody, and thank you all for being here. John, Paul, distinguished speakers. I'm not sure why I'm up here, but I agreed to say a few words. So I think what I'll probably do is speak out of turn and say a few private things that I probably shouldn't say. First of all, John was entirely right. He first brought Herb to my attention, but I remember him coming back after the 1962 election and telling me that there was a new bachelor MP elected from the city of Windsor, and I'd probably get along with him very well. And I remember saying, "How old is he?" And he was a member of Parliament. I was a student. He said, 31. I said, "You must be crazy, I'm only 19. Nonetheless, I did eventually meet Herb, and John is not that quick about proposing marriage. It did happen 2 years later. In fact, we got married in 1967, only after I graduated from law school and became a member of the bar. So it took a little longer than was originally said, but we got the basic principle right. And it's true that the Liberal Party brought us together, because I eventually met her more formally in 1964 at a Liberal convention. And after that convention, Herb and I spoke a bit about his coming to speak to the McGill Liberal Club, of which I was then the president. And so I thought, well, I don't think the timing's very good, just before exams. So I sent him a letter addressed to, on my personal stationery, saying, "Dear Mr. Gray," spelled G-R-E-Y. I didn't look it up. And I have to tell you that since then I've always told people that spelling out my name, it's G-R-A-Y, Gray with an A, because I made that mistake. In any event, a few weeks later he called and said he was coming to Montreal and could he take me out to lunch. And I had no idea whether it was to discuss the McGill Liberal Club or whether it was personal or what. But I figured it might be personal because he said he'd come to my house and pick me up. And I have to tell you, this created a tremendous amount of nervousness in my household. I came from a very modest family, two hardworking parents who worked very hard to make sure that their children would have opportunities. And I certainly did. I was a first-year law student when Herb came to pick me up. My mother in particular was nervous because we lived in a neighborhood in Montreal. For those of you who know Montreal, will know the neighborhood. It's called Park Extension. It is modest today, maybe even poor. It was just as poor and modest when we lived there. And my mother was nervous that Herb would want to see me after knowing the kind of modest household I came from. And I said, "Mom, I know him well. I don't think it matters one little bit to him." And obviously it didn't, because he kept coming back to that house. And if you wonder where we went to lunch, it was Ruby Foods. In any event, we did get married in 1967. Everyone heard tonight about how progressive Herb is and what a forward thinker he is. And I have to tell you, you'll know because he's celebrating 50 years of service, that he must be, over 80 years old. But he was always a person ahead of his time, and he was a very, very committed feminist. Bob kindly talked about the partnership that Herb and I had, but there were many years when Herb and I spoke opposite things in public. Herb thought that was fine. He was a member of the cabinet. I was then the president and CEO of the Canadian Healthcare Association, formerly the Canadian Hospital Association. And I had the wonderful job, the honor of representing the publicly funded healthcare system in the relationships with the government. And very often it meant that I had to criticize the government. Now, I was an equal opportunity critic. I started by criticizing the Brian Mulroney government. The Liberal government, headed by Jean Chrétien, came in for its fair share of criticism, and Paul will remember that. I wasn't just real happy about the cuts to health transfers, but remember, they started with Brian Mulroney. And when Herb was Deputy Prime Minister and had to answer questions on health, from time to time, he and I would say the exact opposite thing to the press on the very same day, on the same issue. And some journalists were unkind enough to point that out. I thought it was wrong of them to say who my spouse was, because I was obviously independent. But what I really want to say about her is how accepting he was of my standing up and criticizing the government of which he was a member. Now, maybe some of his colleagues didn't like it, but Paul was very good about it. The Prime Minister once asked me why I couldn't do my criticisms in private, like his wife does. I said, because I have a job to do, and my husband respects that job. And so that's an important thing to point out about her. He walked the walk in terms of supporting a spouse who did something independently from him, even if he criticized the government of which he was a part. I don't know whether he ever really agreed with the things I said or not, because you know Herb, he was always very tight-lipped. Because we met through the Liberal Party, and because the Liberal Party was so much a part of our lives for 40 years, and it became a sort of family. But I have to tell you that the only family, the family that really counts for her, is myself and our 2 children and our grandchildren and the spouses of our 2 children. And if you don't mind, I'd like to just single them out for a minute or two. First of all, my son, Dr. Jonathan Gray, is here, and his wife, Dr. Jonathan Gray. Jonathan is a psychiatrist at the Royal Ottawa Mental Health Centre, and I'm a Jewish mother, so I can say, and he also has a law degree. His wife came from England to study at Queen's for her PhD, and Jonathan instead stayed here, but she got the PhD. And I want to point out their 5 children who are here today, and I'm going to list all their names. Lavana, you get a chance to have your name in public. They are Lavana, Ziva, Batsheva, Ezra, and Obadiah Gray. I'd also like to mention my wonderful daughter, Elizabeth Gray Smith, and her husband, James. There's Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a communications consultant in Ottawa, and somehow she gets around town and does all kinds of things. And Elizabeth, remember how 10 years ago what I used to say when I bragged about you? Remember I used to say, she was the Canadian casting director on my big fat Greek wedding. Because at the age of 27 she was, and she had a screen credit, and I was very proud of her for that. So I thought I'd repeat it here tonight. And James, our son-in-law, is a school teacher in Ottawa. Note that Dwight was the Ottawa Public School Board French immersion. They're sticking with it, and works very hard. I'd like to also mention their 2 little daughters, Molly and Lauren Smith. Where are they? Running around. Okay. We're blessed to have 7 grandchildren. I'd just like to note one more thing. Herb has had a lot of interviews in recent years with the press. Not that he hasn't had a lot in earlier years as well, but everyone seems to be doing a PhD thesis or wants to write some article or something. And very often he's asked, so what position did you enjoy the most that you had in all your years in Parliament? And he always says that he really liked being a private member of Parliament. He was a wonderful constituency MP. He loved going to constituency events every weekend. He loved being a member of parliamentary committees. He loved being a committee chair. He loved being a parliamentary secretary. And he had the honor of serving in the cabinets of 3 prime ministers, Trudeau, John Turner, and Jean Chrétien. And all of that was wonderful, and he knew he had a unique opportunity to serve the country. But the one job that he found at the end most rewarding and most challenging was when he was asked in 1984, just after the massive Liberal defeat at the hands of Brian Mulroney, he was asked to be the opposition House leader, and he knew that he would be one of those tasked with rebuilding the Liberal Party. And he knew how important a task that was. And the only thing I would say to you is, Herb always looks to the future, but he also believes history does repeat itself, and the Liberals are back.